Okay, I figure we'll get started. We do have some other people that'll be joining. I think that Mike will be here probably just a minute late if I were to guess. So if you haven't been here before, thank you for joining. I'm Christian Ross, and I own Ross Title and Ross Law here in Naples. Um, we've been spending the last 6 or 8 weeks talking almost exclusively about this NAR settlement and how it's kind of affecting or changing how we do business. But at the end of the day, we still have to get deals done. And so today we'll get into that. And the thing that I'm seeing right now that freak me out are the subject to deals. I would definitely ask if anyone has any experience on these, because it's not just my opinion that matters, it's your opinion that matters on this stuff. But let me first start by explaining what a subject to deal is, how it should be evaluated compared to maybe other options that are out there, and then what the risk and rewards are ultimately. What's the purpose for doing how to explain it to your customer, all the good stuff, all the fun stuff. So, all right, so subject to is just a shortened phrase, which if we said the entire sentence, it would actually make a little bit more sense. The buyer is purchasing the property subject to the existing mortgage or mortgages. So the seller has a mortgage, maybe it's a low interest rate, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's just an attractive deal. If you didn't have to go out and get new financing, you could just piggyback off of the seller's existing loan. Sounds like a great deal for a buyer and possibly a good deal for the seller, because we'll just use simple math on this. Let's say it's a $500,000 deal. There's a $400,000 mortgage. So the seller is really hoping to get maybe $100,000 out of the deal, not excluding maybe commissions and closing costs, things of that nature. So from the buyer's perspective, or let's finish with the seller. From the seller's perspective, sounds like a great deal. Someone else is going to pay my mortgage. I get the equity that was tied into the property. Maybe they pay full price. I'm just focused on the equity no matter what. So what do I care what the buyer does and what happens to the mortgage? Separately, from the buyer's perspective, they don't have to go out and get mortgage financing. They don't have to apply for the loan, pay for an appraisal, get a survey. They don't have to use their own credit to get this loan. It's a pretty sweet deal. In fact, if you buy a house with a $400,000 mortgage, you're probably looking at between taxes, title insurance, origination fees, appraisals, and surveys, maybe even points, escrows, things like that. You're on a $400,000 deal, you're probably $5,000 to $10,000 in cost right up front, which you could avoid. So in that $500,000 purchase price just got a lot sweeter, got a little bit more attractive. You saved 1, 2, 3% on the purchase price as the buyer. And that's a wonderful deal. And if you are a buyer on a deal like that, if you have the money to put up the equity, there's no limit to how many of these you could do. In fact, I want to show you guys let's see, screen one. Hopefully you'll see this. This is a guy that I had heard about online. Well, I don't know if I'm showing this correctly. There he is. All right, so this is on YouTube. This guy's name is Pace Morby, Creative Finance Real Estate. And so this guy's kind of made it a little bit more attractive and seemingly normalizing the whole subject to deal. And so there are a lot of copycats. I would say he's in the realm of wholesaler or something of that nature. I'm not a huge fan. I think he's incredibly engaging, and if he means well, then wonderful. But what he's doing is he's teaching people how they can reach out and make these deals without putting in any of their own money or without having to put their credit on the line or anything like that, and the seller still gets everything that they wanted. It's really not the whole pitch, it's not the whole story, and that's what I wanted to get into. Hey, Mike, welcome.
Hey, how you doing?
So we're talking about subject to deals, and I kind of broached this topic to you before earlier in the day. You really haven't seen subject to deals. You're not really that familiar with them, right?
That would be correct. That's why I'm attending.
Good. So you're in the boat with most other people. And in fact, over the last, I don't know, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks, I've seen more and more of these deals. And they tend to, just like wholesalers, they will reach out to a buyer or a seller. They'll reach out to a seller who's maybe a little desperate. The property's been sitting on the market. It's a little stale. Maybe they're starting to have some financial stresses, or they're just kind of thinking there might be some financial stresses. So they can offer near the full purchase price or close to it. Seller gets all their equity out of it. You just have to be willing to accept the fact that they're not going to pay off your mortgage at closing. They're just going to keep making those payments going forward. Sound like a good deal, Mike? Where do you see any issues with that?
Beware.
Yeah, beware. So what are the risks? Here are the risks. So we just talked about the good stuff. The good stuff is that it could save buyer and seller money. If you don't have to do a whole new loan, it should save some money. Technically, I could do a closing like that on a title commitment or a title policy. We would give the buyer clear title subject to that existing mortgage. We're not making any claims as to that existing mortgage. We're just saying, hey, it's still there. Buyer takes over after that. Well, that's where the fun begins. So the seller's out of the property. They're off title. They have signed away their rights to the property, but their credit is still locked in with that mortgage. They could, so let's start thinking about it. If the buyer, let's say it was a flip, it was supposed to be a 6-month deal. They wanted to keep that financing in place so that they could just put in a quick 50 grand and paint it and put in new flooring and whatever else, and then put it back on the market for a profit. Everyone wins. Well, if the buyer made a bad decision, if they didn't have contingencies, or if their budget went out of whack, and all of a sudden they're upside down, what is the buyer going to do? They're going to walk away. And if the buyer walks away, if it's no longer a good deal for the buyer, what does that do? Well, it really messes up the seller. Now, you wouldn't think that initially. The seller sold and they got their money. But if the buyer doesn't pay the mortgage, now that loan goes into default. It starts hitting their credit, the seller's credit, not the buyer's credit. It starts hitting the seller's credit, and the seller has no control, none. They can't take the property back. They can't foreclose. Maybe they could sue for waste or something, but I don't even know about that. But ultimately, the seller's just on for the ride. They have no control. They can't even grab the wheel. The only benefit would be if the buyer was kind enough to give them the property back, to sign a quick claim deed back to the seller and say, hey, it's your problem again. Sorry, it didn't work out. And you can see the issue really comes into play if that equity the seller got was really, really small. If it was $5,000 or $10,000 or something like that. So the buyer doesn't have a whole lot of skin in the game. I saw one recently, Mike, where the seller had been trying to rent the property, couldn't rent it, decided to put it up for sale, wasn't having a whole lot of luck selling it. So this buyer comes in and says, well, hey, I'll buy it subject to. That whole buyer's plan was to do exactly what the seller had just done. Try to rent it, then try and sell it. So how does that save anybody anything? I think the seller was going to get 5 or 10 grand, maybe. The real estate agents were going to get paid. The title agent was going to get paid. We were going to close the deal. But the seller, if that buyer didn't follow through, if the buyer didn't have any luck actually renting, they would just walk away and they'd be like, oh, well, I lost 5 grand or I lost 10 grand, so be it. And then they'd be gone.
The problem that I see, Christian, is when the seller thinks that, oh, good, this is getting me out of a problem, and the buyers seem decent, reputable, whatever, and then the buyer later on loses their job, or maybe the moneymaker in the buyer side dies.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that can go wrong.
Yeah, there really are. The first time I ever really dealt with this was in Atlanta, and the buyer was the uncle. So it was actually a family member. So the uncle comes in and says, hey, I'll pay you your equity. I think it was like $80,000. So I'll pay you your equity. It was a $500,000 property. And I'll spend the next 6 to 12 months flipping the property, build, fix it up, do this, do that. I'm gonna, add a bedroom or whatever it was. I'll put 100,000 into it, and then I'm gonna sell it. And the seller was thrilled. He's like, oh, it's my uncle, and it's this and it's that. I said, well, what happens if the uncle gets hit by a bus? And she's like, well, I don't know. Don't I get the property back? No. No, it's in his name. It's in his estate. It goes to him. In the meantime, you had to pay taxes on your money potentially. Maybe not, depending on how, if it was principal residence or things like that. But I think she went through with it anyways, and it might have worked out for everybody. But for the other side of it is, what was she going to do once she sold? So her plan was to find something more affordable. So she was selling this for $500,000. She was going to downsize, buy something that was 200,000 or 300,000. And obviously she was going to have to use the money for this from the sale, but then she was also going to have to get a mortgage to cover the difference. And when the lender pulled up her credit, they still saw that existing mortgage on the table. And they said, well, we have to account for that in your debt to income ratio. And she's like, well, why? It's not my loan anymore. I sold the house. He goes, well, you didn't pay the mortgage off. So there's now a workaround, and this is the next level. Any of these types of schemes or plans, they evolve over time. They start at a simplistic, like, hey, I'll do this. And then as we start to see problems, they start coming up with solutions. They're not always perfect, but they are solutions. The latest solution that I've heard is that once the other buyer makes payments for 12 months, and the credit reporting can show 12 months of payments on that mortgage from some other revenue source, the new lender, if you were to buy a new property, can disregard that existing mortgage. How does that work? I mean, they almost see it as a rental, I guess. I think that's how the lenders are getting comfortable with it. But personally, that's 12 months of not knowing. A lot of times, things happen. What are the chances that a tenant doesn't pay the rent, let alone a buyer who's flipping it and, learning from someone that's online or whatever it may be? It's very, very risky. Very risky. I've seen them go bad a lot more than I've seen them go well. So just be careful. If you get an offer like that, it's only for very desperate solutions or issues or people. If a seller is incredibly desperate and they're not depending on having to go get another mortgage, and they're willing to take the risk, if they can evaluate the risk that's in front of them, then maybe, but only if there are no other options. Only if there are no other options. I'd rather go through a short sale. Mike, what's your experience on a short sale?
Well, I can remember when this started happening back then in 2006, I believe. The brokers were calling each other wanting to know what a short sale was. But I mean, my experience with a short sale is you better be honest with the bank.
Yeah,
Because
and there's so many rules with short sales. I would say, in being on this side of the table or as a realtor, they're a pain, but sometimes they're necessary. And for a seller, they can be a lifeline, because a lot of times, the seller is desperate, and it does take a lot of risk off the table. Now, someone messaged me, and this is someone that I've been working with behind the scenes about deals just like this. So in a sense, her deal inspired me to do this video. Her question was, well, what if there's documentation stating that if there's a missed payment, the home goes back to the seller? Well, we kind of have documentation like that for loans, and it takes 6 months for the property to go back to the lender. Minimum 6 months from like when they start filing everything. So you have a missed payment, And then, they start talking to you and say, oh, I'm so sorry, we'll make up for it. And just like, a deadbeat debtor would do. And you delay hiring an attorney, you delay filing anything, you hope that this borrower will come through for you. And then they don't. Tenants do the same thing. Tenants and landlords do the same thing. So I haven't seen what documentation and how it actually works, because it's not a foreclosure. It's almost just like a suit for reversion. It's reversion back to the original grantor. I've never seen a lawsuit like that. I'm sure it would work, but how long would it take and how expensive would it be? If you were getting $80,000 from a sale and hoping to use that money, on another purchase or to do something else or put the money in your bank account or retire or whatever it may be, are you really going to want to spend 20 or 30 grand taking the property back? One that already failed you once, one that, you don't want. And maybe the buyer made a mess of the property in the meantime. Maybe it's been sitting there vacant, or worse, maybe they ripped it apart hoping to do some sort of construction or remodeling, only to realize they ran out of money. And now you're really stuck. It does matter who the buyer is. It matters what happens to the buyer. It matters what plan the buyer has, because you guys are partners, ultimately. You're partners in this, whether you appreciate that or not. It's a little freaky. I will tell you that if you're being presented an offer to do a subject to deal and you need to present it to your seller, you have to do it with an education about what the risks are. What's the upside? What's the risk? And you simply tell the seller, look, this is a desperate move because of the risk of what the buyer does. You're tied to this buyer until that loan gets paid off. In fact, I think on the deal that we were working together on, they actually made a point of saying, we don't sell properties. We buy and hold 10 plus years. Well, that means that seller's on the hook for the next 10 years or more until that loan is paid off. And the other thing on there, Mike, do you think a lender likes this?
Not
Lenders
really.
don't like this. Lenders
No.
hate this, because not only do they not get their money back, but they're being lied to. They're being lied to who the borrower is, or who's actually living in the property and what's being happened, because they're not being told. None of this, they're not being asked whether this is going to be allowed. It's just being done. And you're hoping that the lender doesn't find out. And then the lenders, they do annual reviews of insurance and taxes to make sure everything is in order. Well, if they find that the insurance is in the name of some other person, they're going to flag it. And on those reviews, they can call the loan. And so if due to no fault of the buyer or the seller, maybe the lender calls the loan and says, hey, we found that you transferred the property. We need you to rectify this, to cure it, send it back to the original seller, or pay us back in full. They'll give you like 30 days. Otherwise, they will foreclose on you.
Christian,
Actually, I've had customers do that.
couldn't that be flushed out though? Because when the lender requests proof of homeowner's insurance and they got someone else's name on it, I mean, it would seem like that would be brought to a head pretty quick.
It can be, yeah. Some lenders don't care. Let's say you buy a property, Mike, and then you want to put it into your LLC. A lot of times the lenders don't care. Some of them do. I have a couple of tricks that we use to try and keep the lender calm. We'll get their approval in advance, or we'll put both the original buyer's name and the LLC on the insurance so that it passes their audit, hopefully, but there's no guarantee. But yeah, the lenders can be pretty proactive about that stuff. They do regular audits on this annually at least. And if they see that the insurance isn't lining up, then it's a problem. And they will reach out to the original borrower, the seller, and the seller will get this letter saying, hey, you're in default and the insurance is wrong and da 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 da. And what does that seller do? It reaches out to this buyer who may or may not be a good partner, may or may not want to put the property into a proper name, may or may not want to comply. And they'll just ride it till the wheels fall off. It's really scary. I do not like subject to deals. I really don't. Someone else asked on the subject to purchase, what are the risks for the buyer? Seller's second mortgage, other risks. Okay, so Yola, this is a great point, and someone brought this up as a solution. Um, the risk for the buyer are that you pay all this money to the seller. Say it's $100,000. You pay that $100,000 to take over this property, and 30 days later, the lender calls the loan. That's a big risk. You know, that ultimately you're going to get foreclosed on. You're going to have to sell that property and see what money you can get out of it before the lender really finds out what's going on. That's a big risk. I think that's a huge risk. So a lot of these subject to buyers tend to keep their outlay of cash as low as humanly possible. They'll reach out to other investors and use other people's money, OPM, or they will just minimize their risk and they'll spread it across 10, 20, 30 properties. And on each one of them, they'll put 10 or 20,000 bucks. So if one or two of them default, they can just let them go. And then they still have 8 that are performing. So the buyer can diversify their risk if they're willing to hurt as many people as possible. That's the solution. I did find there was another solution that if instead of, like, let's say we'll go back to our $500,000 model, there's a $400,000 mortgage. The buyer says, hey, I'll pay 50 grand in cash, and then the seller will do seller financing for the other 50,000. So in that scenario, if the buyer stops paying the mortgage, not only would they stop paying the first, but they'll stop paying the seller's financing as well, the second mortgage. The seller could foreclose and at least take the property back. They'd have the 50 grand in their pocket, plus they foreclosed and they got everything back. Well, it's very expensive to foreclose and time consuming. And the buyer may have ruined the property in the meantime. So it's risky. I did like that solution for a seller where they hold on to a small second mortgage, where you even said, like, if you are ever in default on the first mortgage, that's a default on the second, and we can foreclose on that. I really do like that, but it's still a slow process. And a lot of damage could occur in the 6 months it takes to take the property back. So that one's fun. And someone says, I always thought you had to have I don't know
I think they
exactly.
say you have to be behind on the mortgage payments.
To do a short sale. Yeah, so let's talk about short sales next. So that's subject to. I'm not the biggest fan, as you can tell. Subject twos are tough. Do you have to be behind on short sales? So let's look at a short sale. Short sale is pretty simply that you owe more on the mortgage than the house is worth. So you paid your 500,000 for the house. They gave you a $400,000 mortgage, but now the house is worth 350. That's a pretty extreme example. I think more likely the scenario would be like you paid 500,000, you got a $460,000 mortgage, and now the property's worth 450. So you're down. Plus, if you pay commissions and closing costs, you're way down. You know, you're really struggling here. So we actually have a deal right now, Mike, that's a short sale, and it's different numbers. I think they paid $1.5 million for the property. They borrowed 1.4 or 1.3, and now the property is being sold for 1.2. So they really made a mistake. They bought it wrong. They were having trouble with the mortgage. They couldn't rent it out. It wasn't cash flowing, and so the owners of the property are like trying to get out. And so a couple of things have to come into play, and I don't have my notes in front of me exactly what's required, but generally speaking, short sales are when you reach out to the lender and say, hey, I can't pay this mortgage back. Will you allow me to sell it and you'll take a lesser payoff? The seller will agree not to take any money from the closing. So the seller gets zero. That's a big one. And the lender agrees that the property is worth this. It's worth what they're selling it for. There has to be a contract. I think the borrower, like they said, the borrower has to be missing payments already. They have to be in some sort of distress. I think they have to make a statement in writing that they have financial distress, that they're not making money, they're facing bankruptcy, whatever it may be. And so lenders will review that seller and what their financials are, not just whether they're paying the mortgage or not just what the property is worth. Because lenders get personal guarantees on every loan, pretty much every loan. You know, when you sign a note in a mortgage, the note is you saying, I'll pay the lender back. The mortgage is just a lien on the property. So if the lien on the property is not enough, then the bank can sue you for the mortgage, for the note. They can come after you and say, hey, Mike, we sold it for 1.2, but you still owe me another 200 grand. So pay up. And they can attach to all your other assets. They can garnish wages. They can put liens on things. So pretty tricky. That's a short sale. And so when we see short sales, there's a couple of steps, and realtors need to kind of know these steps. You market the property at what you think the property is worth. Don't care about what the mortgage is. So in my scenario, the property is worth 1.2, mortgage is 1.4 or so. You can't list it for 1.4. You're never going to get it. You really have to do your market analysis, make sure that it's worth 1.2, put it on the market, maybe put it for 1.3. And then when you get an offer, you sign the offer with the short sale addendum. Have you seen that short sale addendum before, Mike?
Yep.
Yeah, so you know, their neighbor has one. I think the other associations have them as well. But it basically says that the seller is going to submit the contract, the signed contract, to the lender, and that after a certain time period, you actually write in a date, but after that certain time period, if the lender doesn't approve the short sale, then the buyer or the seller can terminate. So it's really, really important, because if you didn't do the short sale addendum, you would have a signed contract, you'd submit everything to the lender, and the lender said no, the seller would have to come out of pocket to pay the difference. And I don't think many sellers want to do that if they can avoid it. That wasn't the deal.
Back in 2006, Christian, when all the short sale phenomenon happened, this is right after the real estate bubble burst, where I saw some people getting in trouble, and they should have gotten in trouble, is they were doing short sales, but they had side deals where something the bank was not aware of, or maybe they inflated the price of the furniture. They were selling the furniture at an inflated price. You can't do that. That's bank fraud.
Yeah, it's mortgage fraud. So we have to be very careful. You know, when everything is appreciating, it seems like a no-brainer. And a lot of times things get picked up or they'll get cleaned up just if the property goes up in value. But if you bought near the top of the market and then you see a retraction, then you start seeing, you know, the tide pools, as I like to say, where all the, you know, the dead fish are on the sand, you know, because the tide receded. So, you know, banks do their best to evaluate the risk on this stuff, but sometimes they get it wrong too. And if they got it wrong, they'll agree to this stuff. It's just they got to be able to move on. And short sales are a wonderful tool for that. Are they a pain in the neck? Yes, they are, because there's no time frame. You know, I would say in my experience, not if we ignore the 2008 fiasco, in my experience, most short sales take 30 to 60 days to get approved, and then the closing comes soon after that. I'm dealing with one right now where it's probably going to be like a 3-week closing, because the lender is a small private lender. So they're more flexible and they want to get a deal done because they're not receiving income in the meantime. So if they can get 90 cents on the dollar and they've agreed that the property isn't worth more, they'll take it. They're not going to wait this out. They don't want to be real estate investors. So that's short sales. Short sales are a mess. You also have foreclosures. So typically the way loans work, especially here in Florida, is that if you are late by the 16th day, so day 1 is when you can make your first payment. Day 15, you can still make it without any penalties. But day 16, you're late, and there's a late fee, usually, you know, a couple $100 or a couple % of the late payment. By day 31, you're in default. So, you know, you got 1 month to get that mortgage in. Day 31, you're in default. Most lenders at that point, they'll start sending you letters. You know, they'll reach out, what's going on, what's happening, how can we help? They don't usually file foreclosure right away. You're deficient in your payments. By month 2, 3, maybe 4 or 5, depending on the lender, depending on the circumstances, then they will hire an attorney. They will institute the foreclosure proceedings in Florida. They have to file a lawsuit. So they'll send notice, they'll file a lawsuit. They have to get the judge to sign off on it. The big thing on foreclosures is, do they have the proper paperwork? Did they give notice to all the relevant parties? Can they prove that they're in default? If all that's true, the judge will allow it. They'll issue the foreclosure. They sell it at auction. It takes, I would say, minimum 6 months. So if you don't make your September payment, by next year they'll be selling the house at foreclosure auction, usually at the county steps. In the meantime, that seller, if there's equity tied up in the property, they can't make the payments, they lost the job, they're sick, whatever it may be. In the meantime, they should sell the property if there's equity, because if they let it go to foreclosure, it probably limits the amount of equity that they could ever get back. They could get some, even if it goes to foreclosure, but most likely the best bet is get it sold. So if you are going after a property that is in pre-foreclosure, it's a term that we've kind of made up. In my mind, you're in foreclosure and then it's sold. So it's like you're not in foreclosure, you're in foreclosure, then it's sold. It's like, that's how I would look at it. But in the marketing of this industry, they talk about pre-foreclosure. That just means from the time they didn't pay to the time that hasn't sold or a time it will sell. So you find a seller who's in that scenario, and there's foreclosure proceeding that's pending. They filed a lis pendens down at the county courthouse, whatever it may be. That's a seller that should be willing to negotiate. What do they owe? What's it worth? What's it worth to them to get a deal done? How risk averse are they? How desperate are they? What are their plans to go afterwards? It could be a really neat deal. And honestly, what you're doing is you're making a market priced offer, and then maybe getting a better deal than that if the seller is truly desperate. If the auction is being held in 2 weeks and that seller knows he has no other options, any money the seller can get from you is probably better than waiting for the auction to be held. You ever seen one of those foreclosure auctions, Mike?
Yeah, I actually, an interesting auction I went to a while back was the county auction, where they auction the properties off down there at the courthouse.
The county handles all the real property foreclosures. I think you have to register. It's a really neat process, but if you can get in before the auction, you might be able to get a deal without much competition. They're tricky. They're tricky deals, but I like those because you can, if you give yourself enough time, you can do title searches, and you can get title insurance. You can start with a clean slate and get a good deal. The seller is helped out because they were desperate, and the buyer gets a good deal. I think that's a win-win for everybody. If you pay attention to the foreclosure auctions and what's coming up in the next couple of months, what just got filed, a lot of them get resolved before they go to auction, and some of that is because people make deals ahead of time. So those are kind of the 3 biggies when you have a market that's kind of stalling, because you have owners that are they're treading water barely. And if they start to kind of fall below the surface, they need some help. And so you've got those subject to deals, which I do not like. You've got the short sales, which, yeah, they're a lot of work, but they work. And then you've got the foreclosures. One other thing, Mike, that I've seen recently is honestly, I think I've done 2 in my whole career, are the assumable loans. Have you ever seen an assumable mortgage?
Wow, I've heard of them.
Yeah, and that's kind of how I felt about it. They're pretty rare. I've had a couple of people ask me about them. So this is typically FHA and VA loans. Those are the only 2 that are typically assumable. So there's assignable, which is different. Assignable means that one lender can assign it to another lender. So that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about assumable. So that means one buyer can assume the loan from the other buyer. And it's very similar to a subject to deal, but it's on the up and up. It's super clean. It's really great because the buyer gets a better interest rate with the old mortgage than they would with getting their own new mortgage. And they're a lot less cost. So I think I saw a comment in here. Does the buyer have to go through special qualifications for an assumable loan? Yes. So, but it's pretty simple. If, let's say, for example, the seller has an FHA loan, then the new buyer would have to get approved for an FHA loan of that same amount. So if it's a $400,000 FHA loan, the new buyer would have to go through an application with that lender, that same lender, to get approved as an FHA borrower for $400,000, that interest rate, that mortgage amount, all of that. If they can be approved, there's no appraisal necessary, there's no survey, there's no lender's title insurance, there's no transfer tax on the mortgage. So in Florida, transfer tax is pretty expensive. It's $5.50 per thousand. All those costs go away. There's usually no origination fee or anything with the FHA. I think there's just like a $250 cost, or it might be a little more than that now, but it's somewhere in like a couple $100 to assume this loan. And then the buyer will get a second loan to cover whatever extra interest or whatever other loan they may or may not need. So the first 400,000 they get, and then maybe they need another 25,000 or 50,000. They can go get a second mortgage for that as long as they qualify. And that would probably be at a different interest rate, different terms, different lender possibly. But there are some downsides, like short sales, they take forever. They take forever. So the last deal I did with one of these assumable mortgages, I think the buyer moved in and they applied, they got approved, and it took the lender 6 months to finally get it done and do the closing. So the buyer was paying the mortgage in the meantime as a renter, essentially. And then once the loan got done, we closed it and all the money got released. Funny enough, the struggle we had on that deal, other than the timing, because the timing was challenging, the struggle we had is that the seller wrongly assumed that he was actually going to make more money with an assumed mortgage. So what he saw was on our, let's do our $500,000 deal, that he's going to sell it for $500,000, but he doesn't have to pay back the $400,000 loan. He didn't think he had to pay it back at all. So he thought he was going to make 500,000, total, as opposed to making 100,000 if he did a normal sale. No, it doesn't work that way. You're the net of whatever debt the buyer is assuming. So it's like those big corporate mergers you hear about, Mike, that they bought this big company for $1 billion and assumed 800 million in debt. Well, they didn't write a check for $1 billion. They wrote a check for 200 million. And then they assumed 800 million. So then the net for the seller was $1 billion, even if they didn't get that in their pocket. So that one was fun. It was really hard to get the seller to understand that he wasn't getting $500,000 on that deal. But it was good for the buyer. He got a very good interest rate that he never would have been able to get. I think it was like a 2%, 2.5% interest rate, and the market was at 6 or 7 otherwise. So it was worth it to all of them to make this work, and they paid top dollar in order to get it done. So that one was interesting. Yvette had a question, just a follow-up on short sales, and then I wanted to get into something else. So why can't the contract, this is not short sales, this is the subject too. Why can't the contract be written the way you said, with seller getting the property back if the buyer defaults on the loan? For example, only accept the deal if the lender must approve the release request, releasing the seller of all liabilities from the loan, doing it with lender instead of behind their back. That would be an assumable mortgage. So I'm glad that we followed up. So that kind of brings it full circle. Assumable mortgages are when the lender is approving it, but there are only 2 lenders that allow it, FHA and VA. No other lenders allow assumable mortgages unless it's some sort of privately financed deal, some sort of wealthy investors that are funding the loan. I do have something else, Mike, that I wanted to share. So this is going to be the newest thing that you guys are dealing with. There's a new Florida flood disclosure requirement coming. And I think this is going to be applicable by the end of the year. They are going to be changing the sales contracts to include language regarding this disclosure. So Florida sellers must disclose previous flood damage to buyers before contract signing to provide transparency in real estate transactions. So actually, this starts October 1. It's a little sooner than I thought. You'll see all these requirements being inputted into our contracts. And this is a major, major requirement. You cannot be silly about it. You can't kind of downplay it, and you can't just forget conveniently, because this is something that will destroy a seller for not disclosing. And that is, ultimately it ends on us, the realtors and the attorneys and the title companies, to make sure that the sellers disclose this. So there's not much for you guys to do right now, but if you do have a listing, I would suggest that you start the paperwork and ask the questions. Hey, there is this transparency requirement regarding floods. Let's go back over, the entire time that you've owned the property and detail any flood. And that's not just exterior, but it's multiple things. So flooding is defined as general or temporary condition of partial or complete inundation of the property caused by any of the following. So overflow of inland or tidal waters. Those are the things we really worry about. The unusual and rapid accumulation of runoff or surface waters from an established water source, or sustained periods of standing water resulting from rainfall. Some examples of the established water source can be a river, stream, or drainage ditch. So this is the big thing that we're going to see, and it's going to add to our list of things to do, unfortunately. Have you heard about that one, Mike?
Yeah, there's more paperwork. But like you said, that's the one thing the seller does not want to forget to disclose.
Yeah, I know.
That's the same as saying that forgetting to tell them there's a hole in the roof. You'll get in trouble pretty quick.
Yeah, definitely do that. So the other thing I wanted to talk about, actually, it looks like we have a couple of questions. Yvette, did you have something you wanted to bring up?
Yeah, when you said that, I did hear something about this change coming, but I didn't understand it.
Yeah.
One of the most common ones I saw in the last year was manufactured homes that, perhaps no water got in over the flooring, but it was underneath the unit. So during a lot of these events, the owners aren't in town. They come back and they say, oh, okay, my unit wasn't flooded. And so then they go to sell it, and they tell their agent, and their agent tells the other agent, and the buyer comes in and makes an offer that, there was no flooding. And then it has an inspection, and underneath, salt water inundated the ductwork, the, what is it called? There's insulation under the flooring, and it's still all wet.
Yeah, the crawl space and all that.
Yeah, it's almost like these people want to have their head in the sand like an ostrich, to not investigate that they actually had flooding. And that happened in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I would agree that there's a certain subset of people that they just want to be able to get their money out of the deal, and they don't necessarily appreciate the harm that they're causing to future buyers. I think that it has, you might see someone get away with it on one deal or two deals, but when enough of those happen, it severely impacts our market. And I've seen that with condos. I've seen that with flooded properties and insurance issues as well, where like, all right, I see like one of them is like, oh man, that's weird. I can't believe they did that. But when you see it over a 10-year period, it really freaks you out. And it's like, it pulls away from the genuine nature of most sellers, the people that want the buyer to know, that want them to feel good about what they're buying. And they're not out just to harm everybody else for their own benefit. It's really tricky. And I think mobile homes, especially, I wouldn't have thought about what that does to a steel structure or an aluminum structure, you know, that corrosive tendency of any flood water just sitting there in a crawl space. That sounds really bad. Maybe, you know, and that would bring me more and more to say, I think we should be promoting as-is sales contracts with any property, especially something like a mobile home, especially something with a flood tendency. Thank you, Yvette. That's awesome. So Dennis had another point. Would you have to be a veteran to assume a VA loan? I don't think so. I don't think you do. I think you just have to be approved for like an FHA loan in order to get assumed VA loan. The problem there is that the seller doesn't get to reuse their VA benefit. So I think we saw that on one of the subject to deals where the buyer was assuming something, or they were taking their subject to, and I had to tell the seller that they were going to lose their VA benefit until that loan got paid off. So they couldn't just turn around and buy something else using their VA benefit. So that was a really, really big deal. If the seller knows about it and they decide to do it anyways, okay, that's fine. That's on them. But that is something that, you know, most buyers aren't going to tell you about, and the lenders won't necessarily tell you about it because the lenders aren't really making any money on it. So they're barely paying attention. Christina says, what if it did not affect the property, but just the lobby? I don't know how that law works with condominiums, Christina. You know, I would say that if you know about a flood, you should tell them about a flood. I think that we have, now that there's especially a statute in place, I wouldn't want to be the first person accused of violating it. You know, the property of the whole property may not be covered under that statute, but until we know otherwise, you probably want to take a conservative approach and just say in a disclosure that, you know, the lobby downstairs was subject to a flood, you know, during whatever moment. That's my conservative opinion, at least. Vicky says, what if the seller did not know the property flooded as an estate sale? If you don't know, you don't know. I try and, my advice is that most sellers do know, whether they think they know or not, they do know. You know, if it was mom and dad's house, and they're claiming that they had no clue that the property was damaged in a flood, good luck. You know, maybe you're right. I hope you're right. But if you're wrong, you're going to be in a bit about of trouble. So I don't like that very much. I would say most of the time when a seller for an estate sale says they don't want to fill out a disclosure, I make them do it anyways, because maybe the disclosure will spur their memory. Maybe we'll make them talk to their siblings. Whatever it may be, it's definitely a good idea to have them sign something so that you can at least say you asked and they've said no. Trouble. Kathy says, recently did an assumable VA loan and the buyer was not a veteran. So she just confirmed, you don't have to be a veteran. I didn't think you did. But again, the problem I would see is that the seller doesn't get to keep their VA benefit until that loan is paid off later. So they can't turn around and buy something else at 100% financing. The VA benefit is a really cool thing. The owner of a VA benefit it's a one-time thing. So if you buy a property, if you buy two, you can only use your VA benefit on one of them. Any other loan would be FHA or conventional. But once you sell that VA loan or pay it off, now you get that VA benefit back and you can use it somewhere else. You don't have to get 100% financing, but the VA benefit essentially allows you to finance 100% of the purchase with no mortgage insurance. It's pretty cool. It saves a lot of money and allows veterans to buy homes that they otherwise couldn't put a down payment on. Mike, I want you to talk to me about NABOR and FARBAR and these forms that we all love so much. Can you give a public service announcement on using old forms?
Absolute nightmare. If you've got a date that's 2022 or some other crazy date that can get you in a world of trouble. We had one recently, and the agent looked like she was going to lose well over 25,000, and so it can be a real eye opener. What you're going to find is the brokerage firms, unfortunately, in a position where you know, sometimes we got to tell you that because of the forms you use, we can't help you. we're gonna try to help you, but we're not willing to risk everything. When you made believe me, it's a lesson that you make a mistake once, you'll never forget that lesson.
And I can tell you, we were involved on that, and it was just like, it was heartbreaking because there was no malice. There was, the agent attempted to use the correct form, but used a 2022 form that didn't have some of the required language in this NAR settlement. And so the broker and all the attorneys involved are looking at it and saying, I don't know how to save this one. The buyer was completely comfortable paying a commission or compensation. They had agreed in advance of touring a home, but it didn't have the proper language because it was an old form. It was 2022. And we've never seen that be quite that problematic before, right? That's never blown up a deal beyond recognition. It's never cut someone out of a deal if you used a form that was 6 months old. This time it almost did. Now we found a solution. We're not going to talk about it on the video, but we did find a solution, and it's gonna be okay. But man, this is more and more turning into a profession that has to be done full time.
See, my observation, Christian, is that the terminology of these forms can get a little confusing. The word broker's in a number of them, and agents are trying to use the right form, but they're accidentally using the wrong form. So now what Christian has found and what I have found is because we've worked with these forms day in and day out, they become pretty routine after a while. But for someone who does a deal, let's say once every 3 or 4 months, they're not routine. You got to re-educate yourself each time on which forms you need to use.
You remember what that form was? I'm trying to remember. It wasn't the broker compensation agreement, but let's use that as our example. In the broker compensation agreement, it sounds like the right form, right? So if you haven't done the research like you guys who are watching videos like this or going to NABOR events or reading stuff online, if you're not doing that work and you're looking at all the forms there and you're like, well, I know I have to use a broker compensation agreement. Oh, there it is. You might use the wrong form for the wrong purpose, and you're in quite a bit of trouble. So this is absolutely, all these changes require us to be better. They require us to act on this day in and day out. Taking vacations is fine. I mean, it's always been a big upside of this work environment of being a realtor, is being able to work at your own pace. But there's a risk of not working on it every day. Because if you look at this and you didn't do the research, you're going to make a mistake. And I'll make a comparison, Mike. The governance form that's required on every condo, that was changed in 2021, I think. And I had a really good agents that used the old form from 2020, and they just they said how are we supposed to know? No one told us that the form got updated, and I said, well, it's not your fault. It is your problem. And the only way they would have known is if they had gone to a class about it or read something or done their due diligence or, maybe worked with their broker on that sort of thing. So there is going to be a benefit and an upside to doing classes like this, to asking your broker, being involved, coming in person, going to sales meetings, because you might pick one thing up. In fact, I'll leave you with that. When I left my last firm in Atlanta, the advice that I was given was, if come to the events, go to and this is in a legal world, right? So come to the bar association events, go to the title seminars, go to the classes. And the goal is not to get overwhelmed by all the information, but to pick one thing from every opportunity. One thing. If you come home from a 3-day event and you gathered one thing that can help you in your business, that's a win. And so they would invest, my former bosses would invest on going to these events across the country, across the world, because they knew that if they got one thing, by the end of the year, they'd have 6, 12, 20 new things that could revolutionize the business. Maybe one of them revolutionizes it all on its own. I think that's pretty cool. And that's how we always look at it. So that's where this video series started, was I'm just going to talk about one thing. Now it's kind of beyond that at this point, but one big thing that you guys can pull from it. And if that's not good for you, check out the other videos. Right, Mike? What's your one good thing from the day?
Here's my one good thing, that tonight you're up for an award, and I think your dad might be up too. You're going to leave us with a cliffhanger this week.
Yeah,
Next
so
week
Mike
we'll
and
see
I
who
are
won.
going to the Naples Best Gala. We've been, both Mike's company and my company have been honored previously. I'm hoping to hit the 20 awards plateau tonight. That's what I'm hoping for. So we're up for Best Title Company, Best Law Firm, and Best Attorney. And like you said, Mike, my dad and I are fighting for Best Attorney. We're competing with each other. Probably not a good thing, but
I love it.
he'll be my first call when I beat him tonight.
Absolutely.
All right, guys. Well, thank you for joining another day. All these videos are on YouTube. If you haven't watched this one, or if you want to watch it again, or if you haven't watched some of the previous ones, it's youtube.com/Christian Ross. Mike, I'll see you in a bit.
Sounds good.